They called her just a nurse. Nothing more. A quiet woman in scrubs who moved through Seattle General's ICU at night like she was part of the furniture, unremarkable and forgettable, exactly the way Captain Margaret Walsh needed it to be. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as she entered through the staff entrance at 2,200 hours, her badge clipped to her collar, her hand steady in a way most people would never understand. 8 months she'd been here. 8 months of night shifts, of careful observation, of photographs taken in supply closets and inventory logs memorized with the precision of someone whose life had once depended on details smaller than this. The antiseptic smell of the hospital burned her nostrils like it always did, that chemical bite of bleach and copper that no amount of time could erase from muscle memory. Her feet made no sound on the linoleum. The ICU sprawled before her in shades of white and pale blue, monitors casting their soft glow across empty hallways. 3 nurses worked the day shift wrap-up, their voices low, their attention already drifting toward the parking lot and whatever waited for them in the world outside these walls. Margaret moved past them without acknowledgement, her tablet already in hand, her eyes already cataloguing the supply closet discrepancies she'd been documenting for 6 weeks. The fentanyl count was off by 17 units again. The morphine log showed timestamps that didn't match the nursing notes. Someone was taking what didn't belong to them, and it was her job to prove it without anyone knowing she was watching. At the central medication station, she began her rounds. The rhythm was automatic now: check for bags, verify labels, document volumes, cross-reference with patient charts. Her hands moved through the motions with mechanical precision, the kind of efficiency that came from repetition and training, from years of doing complex work in conditions that made hospitals look like 4-star hotels. But as she reached for the second bag of saline, her fingers trembled. Not from fear. Never from fear. The tremor came from something deeper, from the weight she carried in her shoulders, from the muscle memory of things her body remembered even when her mind tried to forget. She paused, gripped the edge of the medication cart, let the moment pass. In the photo on her phone, the one she kept locked in a drawer at home, not here, 12 operators stared back at her. 12 faces she had trained. 12 soldiers she had led through fire in the mountains outside Kandahar. 2 of them weren't coming home. One of them had died in her arms in a dust storm that tasted like copper and regret. She had carried his body through 17 kilometers of hostile territory. She had sung to him the whole way because silence felt like surrender. That's where the folded flag came from, the one in her locker beneath her spare scrubs. That flag had draped a casket she wasn't allowed to attend. That flag was the only thing she owned that mattered anymore. Margaret closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them again, her hands had stopped shaking. She moved to the supply closet at the far end of the unit, checking stock levels with her tablet, her eyes cataloguing the slight disturbance in the fentanyl boxes. Someone was careful about it, rotating stock, covering tracks, but not careful enough. The inventory logs on her device showed the discrepancy growing by 0.3 milliliters every shift, minuscule enough to escape most audits, substantial enough over weeks to represent real money, real danger, real federal crimes. She photographed the shelf, the timestamp, the serial numbers on the medication boxes. Her hands were steady now. The radio at her waist crackled with evening traffic, a fall victim in bed 7, discharge paperwork pending in bed 3, routine admission from the ER arriving in 20 minutes. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would bring attention her way. Margaret slipped her tablet back into the pocket of her scrubs and returned to the nurse's station, her movements fluid and unremarkable, a ghost moving through her own assignment. That's when Dr. Pierce arrived. His shoes announced him first, expensive Italian leather, the kind that cost more than Margaret's weekly salary, clicking against the tile with the authority of someone who believed he owned the hospital, or at least the corridor he was currently walking through. He moved with the swagger of a man who had never been told no, whose father had been a surgeon, whose mother's maiden name was probably engraved on a hospital wing somewhere in the Northeast. Margaret had seen his type before. Not in Kandahar. In boardrooms and operating theaters and country clubs where people whose great-grandfathers had money made decisions about people like her. Dr. Pierce was tall enough, handsome enough, the kind of man whose reflection in mirrors probably never disappointed him. His tie was silk. His watch was a Rolex Submariner that cost $40,000. His eyes, when they briefly scanned the nurse's station, passed over Margaret without registering her presence at all. She was furniture. She was air. She was a variable his brain had already filed under irrelevant. "Good evening, Dr. Pierce," Margaret said, her voice soft, deferential, the voice of someone who understood her place in the hierarchy. The voice of a nurse, not a captain. He didn't respond. Instead, he pulled up a chair at the far end of the station and began reviewing patient charts with the focused intensity of a man evaluating quarterly earnings reports. Margaret continued her work, documenting vital signs, preparing medication trays, moving through the routine that kept the ICU functioning like a machine. But she watched him. That was part of her real job too. Observe. Document. Understand the institutional power structures. The man who was stealing medication didn't work alone. They never did. Pierce's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, smiled a smile that looked like it had been purchased from a catalogue of smiles designed to project confidence and superiority. He made a note on a patient chart, his handwriting precise and expensive-looking, the kind of penmanship that came from private schools and confidence that the world would validate whatever he decided to do. The radio crackled again. This time the voice came through with urgency, the kind of shift in tone that made every nurse in the unit pause, that made Margaret's training kick in without permission. Incoming trauma. ETA 12 minutes. Single patient, multiple gunshot wounds, vitals unstable, SWAT escort, requesting trauma surgeon and full ICU prep. The unit went still. Then the machinery of response began. Beds were prepared. Equipment was tested. Suction canisters were verified. Crash carts were wheeled into position. Margaret moved with the others, her hands performing tasks that had become second nature, that lived somewhere deeper than thought. She didn't see Dr. Pierce stand up, didn't see the way his expression shifted from boredom to something sharper, something that looked almost like anticipation. What happened next would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. The ambulance was for minutes away. The patient they were about to receive would arrive with 9 bullet wounds and a voice that kept asking for someone named Walsh. He would arrive asking for the call sign of the medic who had trained him, and Dr. Pierce would see that request as an opportunity, a weakness, a chance to prove that his authority mattered more than competence, that titles trumped scars, that a man who had never held a life in his hands could humiliate a woman who had held so many. But for now, Margaret moved through the ICU with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to survive in places that killed careless people. Her hands were ready. Her mind was sharp. And in her locker, beneath her spare scrubs, the folded flag waited in darkness, carrying its weight of the dead, carrying the memory of the teammate she had promised to carry home. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The ambulance doors burst open at 0247 hours, and Commander James Reeves arrived on a trauma stretcher with 9 bullet wounds mapped across his torso like a geography of survival. His flight suit was saturated black. His breath came shallow and fast. Through the morphine haze, his eyes locked on Margaret as she wheeled him toward Trauma Bay 3, and his voice, hoarse, desperate, cut through the controlled chaos. "Walsh. Need Walsh. Tell her it's Reeves." Dr. Pierce materialized at the foot of the gurney like a magician appearing in smoke. He was tall, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and the presence of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. He moved with terrifying fluid precision, already barking orders before the trauma team assembled. Get 2 large bore 4s running. Massive transfusion protocol. Imaging on all 9 entry wounds. I want to know trajectory, depth, organ involvement. This man is Navy, so somebody call his command. He didn't acknowledge Margaret, though his eyes tracked her movements with the precision of a predator. She worked the line, her hand steady as a surgical laser, inserting the first 4 while the resident fumbled with supplies. When Reeves grabbed her wrist, his grip still strong despite the blood loss, and whispered Reaper. "That you?" Pierce's eyes narrowed to slits. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The next morning, at 0800 hours, Reeves's wife and teenage son arrived with flowers and the kind of exhausted terror that comes from nearly losing someone. Margaret entered the patient room to check his vitals. The oxygen saturation was good. Heart rate elevated but stable. She was documenting the numbers when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway like a shadow crossing water. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, projecting loud enough for the family to hear every syllable. "Mrs. Reeves, I owe you an apology for the care your husband's received during my shift. You see, your husband's been asking for someone named Walsh, claims she's a medic who trained him in Kandahar, and our nurse Walsh here has been, well, encouraging certain delusions about military service. It's concerning behavior. Inappropriate familiarity with patients. We're actually launching a psychological evaluation." The room went dead silent. Margaret stood at the bedside, her hand resting on the 4-pole. She took one measured breath. Just one. In that single breath lived 18 years of boot camp, 3 combat tours, 2 Purple Hearts, and the weight of carrying out her fallen brothers. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from shame, not from fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of being diminished in front of the man whose life she'd trained to save. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave, the way a predator goes quiet before it moves. "Commander Reeves was my replacement in Kandahar, Doctor. I know exactly what 9-bullet wounds look like because I've held enough men with 9-bullet wounds to know the difference between bleeding out and surviving." She paused. "So yes. I know exactly who he is." Pierce's jaw tightened visibly. Mrs. Reeves looked between them with the dawning realization that she was standing in a room with dynamics far more complex than she understood. Reeves watched Margaret with an intensity that suggested recognition, not just of her face, but of her. Pierce's voice dropped to a whisper as he ushered Margaret into the hallway. "Stolen valor is pathetic, Maggie. Especially from someone like you." She didn't respond. She simply returned to the patient room and finished her documentation. But that night, the written warning appeared on the unit board like a blood stain that wouldn't wash out. Dr. Pierce's handwriting was precise, clinical, lethal, written warning, M. Walsh, inappropriate familiarity with patients. Claims of military service without verification. Psychological evaluation recommended. By 0600 the next morning, when Margaret entered the break room, the message had already propagated through the entire ICU nursing staff. 7 nurses occupied 3 tables. The moment her scrubs cleared the doorway, conversations died mid-sentence. Chairs scraped against linoleum. Within 90 seconds, she sat alone with her coffee, black, no sugar, the way soldiers drink it, while the other nurses clustered by the entrance, their whispers creating a frequency she was clearly not meant to hear. Through the small window in the break room door, she saw Pierce in the hallway, nodding to them with the kind of satisfaction that comes from successfully isolating prey. At 1400 hours, he made his move. The formal disciplinary notice had been posted on the unit board where every staff member, every visiting family member, every administrator would see it. Margaret read it as the day's shift arrived, her eyes moving across each word like she was reading a death certificate. The notice was a masterpiece of calculated humiliation. It didn't accuse her of lying. It simply planted the seed, claims of military service without verification. It didn't say she was incompetent. It said her behavior was concerning. It didn't call her a fraud. It recommended a psychological evaluation. Pierce was waiting at the nurse's station when she returned the clipboard. His voice carried across the entire unit, loud enough for physicians and residents and patient family members to hear every word. "You're a nurse, not a soldier, and your fantasy stories are disturbing my patient. People like you, are no credentials, no real accomplishments, need to steal others' valor to feel important. It's actually a recognized pathology. Factitious disorder. You should seek help." Margaret absorbed each word the way a trauma surgeon absorbs impact, with focused breathing and absolute stillness. Her composure was so complete, so utterly unshakable, that it infuriated him more than anger ever could. "Understood, Doctor," she said evenly, and returned to her charting. But her hand trembled as she wrote, not from fear, but from the sheer force of restraint, the same restraint that had kept her alive in hostile territory, the same restraint that kept her from saying what she actually knew. That night, at 2,147 hours, Dr. Pierce made 3 phone calls from his office. The first was to hospital administration. The second was to the nursing supervisor. The third was to risk management. In each conversation, his voice carried the kind of concern that only a conscientious physician could muster. He wasn't shouting. He was strategizing. He was implementing a background check on Margaret Walsh's nursing credentials that would take 7 to 10 business days to process. He was laying the groundwork for her permanent removal. He had no idea what that background check would find. He had no idea that somewhere in a classified database maintained by the Department of Defense, Captain Margaret Walsh's security clearance would suddenly light up like a fire alarm. He had no idea that by requesting her credentials, he was about to trigger notifications that would eventually reach the Pentagon itself. But that wasn't the worst part for Margaret. The worst part was standing at Reeves's bedside at 0157 hours, just before everything changed, and watching his oxygen saturation drop from 94% to 87% in the space of 2 minutes. The worst part was recognizing the signs, the shallow rapid breathing, the trachea deviating left, the sudden collapse of his right lung. Tension pneumothorax. The same wound pattern she'd treated in a cave outside Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, while Taliban fighters closed in on her position, and her medic bag contained exactly 3 minutes' worth of supplies to save a Marine corporal's life. She'd done it then. She would do it now. But she would do it alone, because the resident was in surgery and Dr. Pierce was off shift and protocol would never move fast enough. Her hands moved on their own, the way hands move when they've been trained by the military and tempered by combat and dedicated to the singular mission of keeping people alive. She identified the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She prepped the 14-gauge needle with the kind of precision that comes from having already done this while rounds fired and dust filled the air, and every second meant the difference between bringing someone home or leaving them in a grave on foreign soil. The needle slid between ribs. The hiss of air escaping, that unmistakable sound, like a tire deflating, like pressure releasing, like life returning, filled the silence. Reeves gasped his first full breath. His oxygen saturation climbed, 75. 82, 88. Stable. She was securing the catheter when the trauma bay doors opened and Dr. Pierce walked in. He'd returned to check on his patient at 0203 hours, and what he saw was not a life being saved. What he saw was an unauthorized procedure. What he saw was a nurse who'd exceeded her authority. What he saw was a threat to his control. "What the hell did you do?" Margaret explained the situation with military efficiency: tension pneumothorax, 3-minute window, no time for authorization, procedure completed successfully. Dr. Pierce didn't shout. He was far too intelligent for that. He pulled out his phone and made 3 calls, to administration, to the nursing supervisor, to risk management, with Margaret watching through the trauma bay glass. The calls took 8 minutes total. When he hung up, his composure had returned, smooth as oil on water. "You're suspended pending investigation. Security will escort you out. Badge. Now." Margaret removed her identification badge. The weight of it left a small indentation on her scrubs, a rectangle of missing identity. She handed it to him without a word and walked past the nurse's station where night shift watched in silence. She drove home in the dark, the highway stretching before her like a scar, carrying the knowledge that 8 months of classified intelligence work, 8 months of watching, documenting, identifying the medication diversion ring with ties to foreign operatives, was potentially destroyed because she'd saved one life. The folded flag waited in her apartment. Waiting in darkness. Carrying its weight of the dead. Carrying the memory of the teammate she'd promised to carry home. She had no idea that somewhere in a Pentagon database, alarms were beginning to sound. At 0200 hours, the monitor's soft beeping became the only honest thing in the ICU. Margaret sat at the central station, eyes on the bank of screens, coffee gone cold beside her keyboard. Commander Reeves's room was third from the left, the blue glow of his vitals casting everything in that particular shade of hospital fluorescence that made real people look like ghosts. She watched the oxygen saturation number. 94%. Normal. Safe. Then the slope changed. 92. 90. 89. The number dropped like a stone in still water. Margaret's hand was already moving. Not a reach, not a hesitation. Just movement. The kind that comes from muscle memory older than her nursing license, from caves and sandstorms and teammates who depended on her reading the signs before the signs became catastrophes. 87% in 2 minutes. That wasn't gradual decline. That was collapse. She stood. The chair wheels squeaked against tile, a sound like small screams. She walked toward his room at a pace that looked casual to anyone not trained to recognize controlled urgency. The hallway was empty. 3 in the morning at Seattle General meant skeleton crew, meant the night belonged to whoever was still awake and paying attention. Margaret had been awake for worse things than a single patient in crisis. The door opened. Reeves lay motionless, his chest still rising and falling, but something had changed. His face held that particular grey tone that meant the body was running out of oxygen. She moved to his bedside. Her hands went to his neck first, muscle memory, field assessment, the protocols ingrained so deep they'd become instinct. She palpated his trachea. It was deviating. Shifting to the left. The sign was there if you knew how to read it, the tent of skin between his ribs sucking inward with each breath, the accessory muscles working like he was drowning in air. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against his heart and the great vessels, stealing space, stealing blood flow, stealing time. The clock wasn't metaphorical anymore. Reeves had maybe minutes before his blood pressure crashed into the basement. Before his heart didn't have enough room to beat. Margaret moved to the crash cart, rolling it closer, not fumbling, not asking permission from the silent room. Her hands found the supplies without looking. 14-gauge angiocath needle. She didn't need the whole kit. This was field medicine in its purest form, stripped down to the single move that meant the difference between breathing and not breathing. "Stay with me, Commander," she said. Quiet. Not a prayer. An order. The kind soldiers understood. She found the second intercostal space at his midclavicular line. The anatomy was a map she'd read 1,000 times, once in textbooks, hundreds of times in the dark with lives depending on her hands being sure. The skin was cool under her fingertips. She performed this procedure in a cave 30 kilometers southwest of Kandahar with bullets cracking against stone, with a Marine lieutenant's breath coming in wet gasps, with her own blood mixing with his. This was clean. This was a hospital. This was the easiest version of this moment. The needle went in. Smooth. Deliberate. Muscle memory took over, her shoulders angled, her wrist rotated with the precision of someone who'd done this enough times that her body had stopped asking her conscious mind for permission. She felt the resistance of skin, the subtle give as the needle slipped through the pleural space, and then the hiss. That single, perfect sound of air escaping. Compressed lung releasing like a sigh of relief. Like the world exhaling. The sound a fallen warrior makes when you finally get the bullet out. Reeves gasped. His entire body convulsed with the intake of actual oxygen, real air getting to tissues that had been suffocating. His eyes snapped open. His mouth pulled wide. The sound he made wasn't quite a word. It was older than language, the sound of survival, of the body remembering that it wanted to live. She kept her hand steady. The needle was still in place, the catheter holding open the passage for air to escape as pressure equalized. She watched his chest. The sunken ribs began to rise with easier breaths. The skin tone shifted from gray toward pink, slow, but immediate. Incremental. Saving. His oxygen saturation climbed. 88%. 91. 95. The monitor's rhythm steadied. His heart rate, which had been spiking toward 140, began its descent toward something resembling normal. The beeping changed cadence, faster to stable, frantic to reliable. Margaret was still holding the needle when she heard the footsteps. They came down the hallway with the particular authority of someone who'd memorized the way sound traveled through this space, who knew which tiles didn't creak and which did. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his white coat still pristine at 2 in the morning, his eyes moving from Reeves to Margaret to the equipment scattered across the bedside table. The needle. The angiocath. The clear evidence of a procedure performed without consultation, without protocols, without permission. His jaw tightened. She saw it happen, the shift from confusion to understanding to something colder. His eyes landed on hers and held. Measured. Calculating. The look of someone watching their control slip and beginning to understand the weight of what that meant. What did you do? His voice was flat. Not a question. An accusation. Tension pneumothorax. Margaret's voice was steady. Clinical. She gestured toward Reeves, toward the recovering vitals, toward the objective reality of a man breathing normally again. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Symptoms resolved. O2 sat recovered. Trachea midline. You performed a procedure without physician authorization. I performed a procedure that saved this man's life. Pierce's face didn't change, but she saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. The wheels turning. The strategic mind already 2 moves ahead, already planning how to reframe this moment, how to make her medical competence look like insubordination, how to transform her saving a man into the crime of crossing lines. You have no authority to. He was dying. Margaret's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You weren't here. He had 3 minutes before cardiac arrest. There's no authorization process that works on a 3-minute timeline, Doctor. Reeves was watching both of them, his breath still coming in those deep, grateful pulls. His eyes found hers for just a moment. Long enough to communicate something that didn't need words. The look of a man who recognizes the weight of a debt that can't be calculated in any currency except survival itself. Pierce turned away. He moved toward the door with a slowness that communicated intent. Not rage. Something more deliberate. He was already building his narrative, already collecting the threads he'd need. She could see it in the way his shoulders set, the angle of his head. Your shift is over, Nurse Walsh. He didn't turn around. You're suspended, effective immediately. Hand over your credentials and leave the building. Security will be notified of your attempted theft of hospital equipment. The words hung in the air between them. Theft. That was the move. That was how you made a life-saving procedure into a crime if you controlled the language, if you controlled the narrative, if you controlled the people who wrote down the official version of what happened. Margaret stayed silent. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply finished what she was doing, removing the needle with the same surgical precision she'd used to insert it, ensuring the catheter remained in place, covering the site with sterile dressing. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She moved past Pierce without looking at him. In the hallway, she didn't run. She didn't hurry. She walked at the pace of someone whose legs still knew how to follow orders, whose body understood that composure was a weapon sharper than anger could ever be. Her credentials went into her locker at 0237 hours. She left them on the shelf beside her shoes, the regulation white sneakers that never quite fit right, the ones every shift nurse broke in just enough to be comfortable before leaving them behind for the next person. Above them, tucked in the very back, was a fold of fabric. The flag from the teammate she'd promised to carry out of Kandahar. She'd brought it. Just in case. Just like she brought her military-grade trauma shears, just like she wore her dog tags under her scrubs where no one could see them. Just like she'd spent 8 months watching Dr. Pierce's medication orders, cross-referencing them with inventory logs, documenting the patterns that tied him to the diversion ring. The case file was in a safe deposit box with a number only 3 people knew. She changed out of her scrubs at 0252 hours. The parking lot was wet with the kind of rain that came to Denver in the early morning, soft and persistent and indifferent to whether you belonged anywhere. Her car was parked in the 3rd row. She sat in the driver's seat for exactly 90 seconds, hands at 10 and 2, eyes forward. Then she drove toward home, toward the apartment where her 8-year-old daughter was sleeping, toward the moment when Emma would wake and ask why Mommy wasn't at work. Toward the impossible task of explaining something she couldn't explain, of protecting a secret that was already unraveling, of being a soldier and a mother simultaneously and doing neither of them justice. The rain hammered against the windshield like applause for something she couldn't celebrate. Somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Pierce was making phone calls. Strategic moves. Documented allegations. Reassignments of staff who'd seen what happened. She knew his playbook because she'd been studying it for 8 months. But she also knew something he didn't. The background check he demanded to discredit her nursing credentials was about to flag something in the system that would bring people with more authority than either of them to Seattle General's doors. People who knew exactly who Captain Margaret Walsh was. People who didn't take kindly to classified operations being compromised. She didn't know how much time she had. But she knew something was coming. The machinery was already in motion. And all she could do was drive home, hold her daughter, and wait for the Pentagon to show up. 3 hours after Margaret's hands performed the needle decompression that saved Commander Reeves's life, Dr. Pierce made his first call. His voice carried the precision of someone who'd spent years weaponizing hospital bureaucracy. "I need Margaret Walsh's employment file suspended pending investigation. Patient safety violation. Unauthorized procedure." The administrator on the other end of the line didn't ask questions. Pierce had seniority. He had allies. He had a narrative already constructed, and it was airtight. By the time Margaret pulled into her driveway in Denver at 0530 hours, her security badge was deactivated. Her hospital access revoked. Her employment file flagged with a notice that would follow her to any facility within 500 miles. The second call Pierce made was to the ICU charge nurse. "Reassign everyone on Margaret's rotation. I want fresh staff who can provide accurate testimony about her behavior. Clinical judgment issues. Boundary problems with patients." The charge nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd worked alongside Margaret for 4 years, hesitated for exactly 2 seconds before transferring the call. Pierce had made it clear that hesitation was career-limiting. By 0545 hours, the night shift staff began receiving text messages reassigning them to different units. The witnesses who'd seen Margaret's hands move with surgical precision, who'd heard the hiss of escaping air, who'd watched the oxygen saturation climb from 68 to 89 on the monitor, they were now scattered across pediatrics, obstetrics, the surgical floor. Scattered meant silent. Scattered meant separated. Scattered meant useless. Margaret sat at her kitchen table in the grey pre-dawn light, still wearing her scrubs. Blood, not hers, Reeves's, had dried dark brown on the left sleeve. She'd washed her hands 3 times. The soap wouldn't erase what she knew. She couldn't call her Pentagon contact. Couldn't explain. Couldn't say that Dr. Pierce's investigation into her credentials had flagged her classified clearance, that her cover was compromised, that 8 months of work documenting the medication diversion ring was now burning like a fuse. To explain meant exposure. To expose meant mission failure. To admit she was anything other than a nurse meant the operation collapsed, the intelligence dried up, the foreign operatives scattered before the federal task force could close the net. She understood leverage better than most people understood breathing. She'd spent 15 years understanding leverage, how to use it, how to protect against it, how to recognize when someone else was weaponizing it against you. Dr. Pierce had weaponized her own desire to stay silent. Her classification meant she couldn't defend herself. Her mission meant she couldn't claim the truth. The elegance of his strategy made her respect him, which made her hate him more. Her shoulders shook. Just once. Just for 3 seconds. She pressed her palms flat against the wooden table and controlled the trembling back into her body where it belonged. The tears came without permission. She wiped them with the back of her wrist, leaving a salt and blood smear across her cheekbone. Emma found her like that. Her 8-year-old daughter emerged from the hallway in her purple pajamas, holding the stuffed rabbit she'd had since infancy, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. The morning light from the window caught Margaret's face at exactly the wrong angle. Emma's voice came out small. Smaller than any voice should be allowed to be. "Mommy, why are you home?" Margaret's hands went absolutely still against the table. She didn't lift her head. Didn't wipe her face. Didn't do any of the things that would tell her daughter there was something to worry about. She breathed once. Deep. The kind of breath you take before jumping from a helicopter into darkness. Early shift ended, baby. They're slow today. Emma padded across the kitchen tile in her socks and climbed into her mother's lap. She smelled like sleep and the detergent they used on her bedding. She smelled like normal. Like home. Like everything that Captain Margaret Walsh had sacrificed to protect, and everything Dr. Pierce was trying to take. "Are you sad?" Emma asked. Margaret's hands found her daughter's small back and pulled her close. "No. I'm just tired." It was the only lie she let herself tell that morning. By 07:30 hours, hospital security arrived at Seattle General with a cardboard box and a list. Locker 47. Margaret's possessions. Her personal effects to be catalogued and removed per Dr. Pierce's direct request, evidence preservation for the investigation. The security guard was a woman named Rita who'd shared lunch with Margaret twice and asked about her daughter. Rita tried not to look Margaret in the eye, which meant everyone in the ICU was watching Rita's hand shake as she retrieved Margaret's things. The folded flag came out first. Navy blue, precisely creased, the kind of careful fold that comes from military funeral protocol. Next to it, a photograph of 12 Navy SEALs in tactical gear, taken in the mountains of Kandahar. Margaret's face was barely visible in the back row, hair tied back, weapon slung across her chest, expression like a wolf in human skin. Beneath the photo, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, 2019 deployment. "Where'd a nurse get a Navy Cross citation?" Rita whispered, holding the frame. Corporal Davies, the Marine Guard stationed outside Commander Reeves's room, heard the question. He'd been reading that exact citation for the past 18 minutes. His eyes had gotten wider with each line. "That's Captain Margaret Walsh," he said quietly. "Naval Special Warfare Combat Medic. First class." No one in the ICU moved. At 08:40 hours, Dr. Pierce entered Commander Reeves's room with a tablet and the expression of someone who'd won. The paperwork was printed and ready. Termination for cause. Patient safety violation. Unauthorized medical procedure. One signature and Margaret Walsh would be unemployable in any hospital within the state. Reeves watched Pierce approach, one arm in a sling, still pale from blood loss, but his eyes were the eyes of a man who'd learned to calculate damage. "You'll have proper care now, Commander," Pierce said. His voice was smooth as silk over steel. "That woman won't bother you again." Reeves's hand shot out. His fingers closed around Pierce's wrist with surprising strength. His voice came out low. "That woman has a Silver Star for extracting 12 wounded operators under fire. What do you have, Doc? What's your decoration?" Pierce jerked his wrist free. His composure cracked, just a fracture, just enough to see the anger underneath. "Fabricated credentials. Stolen Valor. The investigation will prove." The window exploded inward. Not glass. Rotor wash. The percussion of a Black Hawk helicopter descending toward the hospital roof sent shockwaves through the ICU, rattling monitors, rattling carts, rattling certainty. Below, in the parking lot, a black Suburban pulled up to the emergency entrance. 2 officers in dress uniforms exited. Their movements carried the weight of federal authority. Pierce turned toward the window and the blood drained from his face because he realized, in that instant, that he had no idea who they were or what they wanted. For the first time in his career, Dr. Pierce understood what it felt like to not control the room. But something was wrong. The rotor wash should have been passing. Instead, it was landing. The Black Hawk was settling on the roof with the intention of staying. Then the first shot echoed through the east corridor. The alarm that followed wasn't the heart monitor. It was the panic alarm. A breach. Armed intruder. A man in dark clothes, face covered, moved through the hospital's east entrance with a weapon raised like he knew exactly where he was going. He knew which hallway. He knew which unit. He knew which patient he'd been sent to eliminate before the patient could be debriefed about what he'd witnessed in Kandahar. The operative reached the ICU threshold at 08 for 5 hours. He saw the Marine Guard first. Saw the weapon on Davies's hip. His weapon came up to firing position. But between the operative and Reeves's door was the nurse's station, and standing at the nurse's station, retrieving her daughter's drawing from her locker one final time, was Margaret Walsh. She didn't hesitate. Hesitation was a luxury for people with something to protect. Margaret had nothing left to protect except the mission. Except the truth. Except the man she'd saved. She stepped into the corridor. The operative fired 3 times. The sound was catastrophic in the closed space, like someone breaking glass inside her skull. 2 rounds punched through the wall. 1 round punched through Margaret's left shoulder, spinning her sideways, driving her toward the nurse's station with an impact that sent her onto one knee. Blood sprayed across the white tile in a pattern like abstract art. She stayed upright. She positioned her body between the operative and Reeves's door, hands raised, one shoulder screaming a language that pain speaks only to people who've learned to translate it. Corporal Davies drew his sidearm with the training of someone who'd spent 2 decades keeping people alive. 2 shots. The operative dropped like marionette strings had been cut. The ICU went silent. Not a metaphor. A complete absence of sound that lasted exactly 3 seconds before the alarms began again, before medical staff rushed toward Margaret, before Dr. Pierce emerged from Reeves's room and saw the blood and the body and the shape of his own destruction beginning to form. The alarms shrieked through Seattle General like artillery fire. Blood spread across Margaret's scrubs, her blood, pooling from the entry wound above her left hip where the operative's 9mm had found her instead of Commander Reeves. Medical staff converged, but Margaret's hand was already pressing the wound with practiced pressure, the other hand gripping the bed rail as a wave of pain transformed into pure information. Pain is data. She'd learned that in Kandahar. She'd learned it in caves and vehicles and on extraction routes where screaming was a luxury you couldn't afford. The operative lay 3 feet away, neutralized by the security detail that materialized with the speed of men who'd been briefed on exactly this scenario. Margaret registered his body without looking directly at it, a technique that preserved her focus, kept her operational. She was still operational. The bullet had missed the femoral artery by margins that felt impossibly thin, but margins were what separated soldiers from casualties. Dr. Pierce emerged from Reeves's room, his face cycling through confusion, then rage, then something closer to calculation as he assessed the scene. He opened his mouth. Margaret could anticipate the words forming, something about unauthorized security personnel, about protocols violated, about his authority reasserting itself over the wreckage. He didn't get them out. A 2-star general in dress blue stepped off the elevator. The general's presence altered the room's atmospheric pressure. This was a man who'd commanded 3,000 personnel, who'd overseen operations across 6 continents, who moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone accustomed to life-and-death authority. He took in the scene in 4 seconds, the operative's body, the blood, Margaret sitting upright despite the wound, her hand still applying pressure with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this in worse circumstances. He rendered a formal salute to Margaret's blood-stained scrubs. No one saluted a nurse. No one saluted civilian clothes. Captain Walsh's code name is classified, Doctor, the general said, his voice like a tank idling in a distant garage. As is her current operation, which your malpractice investigation just exposed. Pierce's jaw tightened. His mouth opened and closed. I don't know what you're... Your suspension of Captain Walsh triggered a background check that flagged her security clearance. That flag reached the Pentagon. That flag reached me. And now everyone in this hospital knows that the medication diversion operation she was documenting for 8 months has a domestic endpoint sitting in this facility. The general paused, letting the implication settle like sediment. You. The words hit with the weight of a closing argument. Margaret watched Pierce's face pale, not from fear, she thought, but from the realization that his strategic competence, his careful documentation of Margaret's suspension, his phone calls and staff reassignments and falsified write-ups, had all been meticulous records of his own destruction. Every action logged. Every contact recorded. Every breach of protocol timestamped. A DEA agent stepped from the elevator. Then another. Then 2 federal marshals in suits that fit like they'd been tailored for this specific moment. Dr. Brandon Pierce, the lead agent said. Pierce looked at Margaret. For a moment, just a moment, his expression shifted toward something that might have been respect, or recognition, or the dawning understanding that he'd been systematically outmaneuvered by someone he'd spent 3 days systematically attempting to isolate and destroy. You're under arrest for diversion of controlled substances, conspiracy with foreign operatives, and operating an unlicensed pharmaceutical trafficking network. The agent produced a card, began the recitation. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say. Paramedics were now lifting Margaret onto a stretcher with the precision of people trained to handle wounded operators. A Navy captain, actual Navy rank, Margaret noted, stepped into her line of sight. Captain, we're transporting you to Harborview. Your daughter Emma is being brought here now. Your team is secure. Margaret nodded once. The investigation files. Uploaded and secure. You got everything we needed. The captain squeezed her shoulder, a gesture somewhere between military acknowledgement and human compassion. You finished the mission. The stretcher moved. Margaret kept her eyes on Pierce as they wheeled her toward the elevator. He was being read his rights at the nurse's station, the exact location where he'd dressed her down publicly 40 hours earlier, where he'd announced to the entire unit that she suffered from confused illusions about military service, where he'd established the narrative he believed would bury her. Staff members watched from behind computer monitors and med carts, their expression cycling through shock and quiet vindication. The woman they'd been trained to dismiss, the woman whose name they'd learned not to use in Pierce's presence, was being protected by 2-star generals and federal agents. The man who'd orchestrated her humiliation was being handcuffed. This is a mistake, Pierce kept repeating as they led him to the second elevator, the one that would carry him to processing. I was protecting patients. I was protecting them from her. But the evidence was surgical. Security footage showed Pierce accessing the medication dispensary during hours when he wasn't scheduled. His override codes masked the discrepancies, or rather, they created a record of his access that was perfectly documented and utterly damning. Financial records displayed deposits to an offshore account in precise increments matching the street value of diverted medications. Phone records connected him to the same foreign operative who'd attempted to eliminate Commander Reeves, the operative now being transported to the medical examiner's office, his phone containing texts that coordinated supply schedules with meticulous detail. The investigation Margaret had built over 8 months, documented in encrypted files she'd uploaded nightly from the encrypted burner phone hidden in her locker, formed an airtight case. Each reassignment Pierce had made, each phone call, each schedule alteration designed to isolate her, all logged. All evidence. His own weapon, turned against him with a kind of precision that suggested divine mathematics. The stretcher rolled through the hallway. The fluorescent lights cast everything in institutional white, but Margaret's focus narrowed to the sound of the wheels beneath her, the controlled breathing of the paramedics, the Marine Guard stationed outside Reeves's room, who caught her eye and nodded, a gesture of warrior-to-warrior acknowledgement. In Reeves's room, Margaret heard the tail end of a conversation. Is she really a captain? That voice belonged to Emma, though Emma shouldn't have been here yet, which meant someone had brought her, protected her, understood that Margaret's daughter needed to be present for the moment when her mother stopped being a secret. "Your mommy is a hero," the general answered, his voice carrying the weight of official recognition. The stretcher continued toward the elevator. Pain was information, Margaret reminded herself. This pain was telling her that the bullet had missed the femoral artery by approximately 0.8 centimeters. This pain was telling her that the surgical team at Harborview would probably repair the lacerated external iliac muscle without complications. This pain was telling her that she would heal, that mission sometimes extracted a price in blood as well as silence, and that the price was worth it if justice followed. 6 months later, the air in Denver carried the crisp metallic taste of autumn. Margaret stood in the parking lot outside the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, watching Commander Reeves walk with a cane, recovery ahead of schedule, the physical therapist said, attributed to the kind of determination that only people who'd survived worse could summon. The bullet wounds had left him moving like a man walking through water, but the trajectory was forward. "Same time next week?" Reeves asked. "Same time next week," Margaret confirmed. Across the street, through the large windows of the community college's main campus, Margaret spotted a familiar figure in a polo shirt with the college logo. Dr. Pierce. He was teaching CPR to a classroom of bored teenagers, demonstrating chest compressions on a mannequin with mechanical movements, his hands moving without conviction or authority. His expensive watch was gone, replaced with a plastic Casio that probably cost $8 at a convenience store. His medical license was permanently revoked. The federal plea deal had kept him from prison in exchange for testimony against the larger network, which meant he would spend the rest of his life teaching the basics of resuscitation to people who would never know that he'd once tried to destroy someone who could save lives from the shadows. Margaret held the folded flag in her hands, the flag draped over her fallen teammate's casket, the same flag Commander Reeves had kept at his bedside during recovery, the same flag he'd returned to her in a ceremony neither of them would ever discuss. The flag represented something beyond patriotism or policy. It represented the choices made in darkness, the sacrifices rendered invisible, the operations that changed the world without headlines or recognition. Reeves followed her gaze through the community college window. Pierce's hands froze mid-compression. He looked up. He saw Margaret standing outside in the autumn light, holding the flag, her presence carrying the absolute certainty of someone who dismantled his entire world through nothing more than meticulous documentation and patient silence. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Margaret didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Didn't offer anything except a single nod, acknowledgement that he'd seen her, that she'd seen him, that the universe had balanced itself with the kind of surgical precision that suggested someone had designed it. Then she turned away, Reeves beside her, and walked into the afternoon sun. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, Margaret said, mostly to herself. Reeves nodded, understanding that she was holding together far more than rooms, entire operations, entire teams, entire missions, and now, finally, herself. Behind them, through the classroom window, Pierce returned to the mannequin. He compressed its chest. Released. Compressed again. Teaching the basics of saving lives to people who would never know that silence and sacrifice, Margaret's and thousands of others like her, formed the invisible foundation upon which security and justice were built. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to Margaret's story. If you believe that the quietest people often carry the heaviest burdens, subscribe and share this with someone who understands the weight of service. The real heroes rarely talk about it. And that silence? That's not weakness. That's strength.